There is a woman in Chinese history who ruled for 16 years. She commanded armies, reformed the tax system, suppressed rebellions, expanded the empire's borders, and sponsored inventions that would change the world. She was called the crown of all empresses by historians. She governed during a decade of natural disasters that should have destroyed her dynasty, and instead she saved it. And almost no one in the West has ever heard her name. She was not Wu Zetian. She did not declare herself emperor. She did not change the name of the dynasty or execute her enemies in spectacular fashion. She did something perhaps more difficult. She ruled within the system. She used the rules of Confucian legitimacy to hold power that, by every traditional standard, should never have belonged to a woman. And when she died, the dynasty she had held together for 16 years began to fall apart. Her name was Deng Sui. And this is the story of how she became the most capable ruler the Eastern Han Dynasty ever had, without ever being allowed to call herself emperor. She was born in 81 AD, into one of the most powerful families in China. Her grandfather was Deng Yu, the foremost of the 28 generals who had helped found the Han Dynasty. Her father was a military commander on the western frontier. She grew up surrounded by power, wealth, and the knowledge that her family's position depended entirely on their usefulness to the throne. And from the beginning she was different. The historical records tell us that at age 6, she was already reading historical texts. By 12, she had mastered the classic of poetry and the Analects. Her mother, a traditional woman, scolded her. "Why do you study books instead of needlework? No woman becomes a scholar." So Deng Sui made a compromise. She practiced embroidery by day, and at night she secretly lit lamps to read the classics. Her father, unlike her mother, saw something in her. When he had difficult decisions to make, he would consult his daughter. She was 13 years old. At 15, she was selected to enter the imperial harem. The records describe her as strikingly beautiful, taller than most women, with a presence that made people turn to look. But what caught the emperor's attention was not just her appearance. It was her mind. She had arrived at the palace at an unusual moment. The emperor, known to history as Emperor He of Han, had invited a woman named Ban Zhao to serve as tutor to his consorts. Ban Zhao was one of the most remarkable figures of her era, a historian, a scholar, the sister of the man who had written the official history of the Western Han, and she had agreed to teach the women of the palace. For Deng Sui, this was not education. This was transformation. She studied with Ban Zhao for years. She learned history, philosophy, astronomy, mathematics. She learned how to read the movement of the stars and the flow of rivers. She learned how empires rose and fell. And she learned something that would define her entire life: the rules that govern power. Not how to seize it, how to wield it. In 102 AD, at age 21, Deng Sui became empress. The position she inherited was precarious. The Han Dynasty had been ruled for decades by child emperors and their regents. Powerful families, the clans of past empresses, had learned to manipulate the system, placing young boys on the throne and governing in their names. The imperial family had become a puppet show, and the empress who preceded Deng Sui had been caught practicing witchcraft. She was deposed. Her entire clan was executed. Deng Sui understood the lesson. Power in the Han court was not about what you could do. It was about what you could be seen doing. And what you could be seen doing depended entirely on whether you could claim the moral high ground. So she did something that confused everyone. She refused every luxury. When the emperor offered to promote her relatives to powerful positions, she declined. When regional governors sent rare and beautiful gifts to the palace, she returned them. When the court planned elaborate celebrations, she suggested simpler alternatives. She lived in modest apartments. She wore plain clothing. She reduced the size of her personal staff. And she began to study the administration of the empire. While other empresses had concerned themselves with palace intrigues, with the fortunes of their clans, with the favor of the emperor, Deng Sui spent her time reading the reports that came from the provinces. She learned how taxes were collected, how granaries were managed, how the military was supplied. She learned where the system worked and where it failed. She was preparing for something. Even she may not have known what. In 105 AD, Emperor He died. He was 27 years old. He left behind 2 sons. One was an infant barely 100 days old. The other was sickly and not expected to survive. The dynasty faced a crisis. There was no adult heir to take the throne. The court turned to Deng Sui. She was 25 years old. She had been empress for only 3 years. By every tradition, her role should have ended with her husband's death. A new emperor would need a new empress, and she would retire to a quiet life in a distant palace, remembered only as a footnote. But there was no new empress. There was only an infant emperor who could not hold a brush, could not read a memorial, could not understand a single word of the edicts issued in his name. And so the ministers did something that had been done before in the Han Dynasty, but never quite like this. They asked the Empress Dowager to govern as regent. Deng Sui accepted. She took the title that would define her, the woman who held the emperor's seal. The infant emperor, known to history as Emperor Shang, lived for less than a year. When he died, Deng Sui made a decision that would be debated for centuries. Instead of returning power to the imperial family, she selected a new child emperor, a 13-year-old cousin of her late husband, known as Emperor An, and she continued to rule. For 16 years she would be the actual ruler of China. Not in secret, not through manipulation, openly. Every edict bore her approval. Every appointment required her consent. She sat behind a screen in the throne room, listening to debates, issuing decisions, managing an empire of 50 million people. She called herself Zhen, the imperial pronoun that only emperors were supposed to use, and she worked. What makes Deng Sui extraordinary is not that she held power. It is what she did with it. She took power at a moment when the Eastern Han was falling apart. The empire was in the middle of what historians would later call the 10 years of floods and droughts, the most severe cluster of natural disasters in the dynasty's history. Crops failed. Rivers overflowed. Famine spread across the provinces. Refugees flooded the capital. Previous governments had responded to disasters with prayers and sacrifices. Deng Sui responded with mathematics. She opened the imperial granaries. She ordered detailed censuses to identify the hardest-hit regions. She reduced or eliminated taxes in affected provinces. She organized government loans of seeds and tools to farmers who had lost everything. She cut the imperial household's budget by 70% and redirected the savings to disaster relief. And she did something that no one had done before. She created an early warning system. She ordered the establishment of astronomical observatories across the empire, not to read omens, but to track weather patterns. She commissioned the scholar Zhang Heng to develop instruments that could detect earthquakes. The seismograph he invented would not be matched in Europe for 1500 years. When refugees rioted, she did not send soldiers. She sent food. When officials complained about the cost, she showed them the ledgers. The cost of feeding a province for a year was less than the cost of suppressing a single rebellion. The famine ended. The economy recovered. And Deng Sui began to think about what came next. She was not a pacifist. When the Chang people in the West rose in rebellion, threatening the critical Heshi corridor that connected China to Central Asia, she sent armies. When the Xiongnu Confederation tested the northern borders, she authorized counterstrikes. When pirates plagued the coast, she ordered naval campaigns. But she did not fight wars of conquest. She fought wars of stabilization. Her generals were instructed to secure borders, not to expand them. When they succeeded, she rewarded them. When they failed, she replaced them. And she understood something that many of her predecessors had not. The purpose of military power was not to demonstrate strength. It was to create the conditions for trade. She re-established the protectorate of the western regions, the Han outposts that had once secured the Silk Road. She sent envoys to the kingdoms of Central Asia. She made sure that the goods flowing into China, horses, jade, glass, precious metals, were matched by goods flowing out, silk, lacquerware, iron. Under her administration, the empire's revenue increased. Not because she raised taxes but because she lowered barriers to trade. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Deng Sui's reign was what she did with culture. She had been educated by Ban Zhao. She had learned that knowledge was power. And she believed that knowledge should be cultivated. She sponsored the improvement of papermaking by the court official Kai Luan. The paper that emerged from his workshop was cheaper, lighter, and more durable than anything that had existed before. Within a generation, It had replaced bamboo and silk as the standard medium for writing. Within a few centuries, it had spread across the world. She commissioned the scholar Su Shun to compile the first comprehensive dictionary of Chinese characters. The work, called the Shuowenjiezi, would become the foundation of Chinese lexicography. It organized over 9,000 characters by radical and meaning, creating a system that scholars would use for the next 2,000 years. She established schools, not just for the sons of the aristocracy, but for their daughters as well. She created an institution that admitted both boys and girls, something that would not happen in most of the world for nearly 2 millennia. She believed that educated women made better decisions. And she believed that decisions mattered. And she kept working. The historical records tell us that she woke before dawn and went to sleep after midnight. She read every memorial personally. She attended every important meeting. She consulted with experts on agriculture, astronomy, military strategy, and law. She corrected officials who made mistakes. She praised those who served well. She governed. That was the word her contemporaries used. Not ruled, governed. As if she were an official who happened to sit on the throne. But there was a problem. The Confucian system that justified her power also condemned it. According to the principles that every educated man in China had learned since childhood, a woman's place was in the home. A woman who held political power was an aberration, a violation of the natural order. The only reason Deng Sui had been able to govern was the exceptional circumstance of a child emperor. As soon as emperor came of age, she was supposed to step aside. She did not. She continued to govern. She continued to call herself Zhen. And she made it clear that she believed her abilities were superior to those of the young emperor. In 119 AD, a relative named Deng Kong submitted a memorial. He pointed out that the emperor was now an adult. He suggested that it was time for the Empress Dowager to retire. Her response was recorded by historians. She said, "I am a woman who has held power for a long time. This is true. But while I have held power, the state has been strong and the people have been at peace. Men could not do what I have done. Why should I give up power?" She ordered that anyone who suggested she retire should be executed. This was the contradiction at the heart of her reign. She governed well. She governed better than most of the men who had held the throne before her. But she governed without legitimacy. She could not pass her position to an heir. She could not found a dynasty. She could only hold on and hope that her competence would be enough. In 121 AD, Deng Sui fell ill. She was 40 years old. She had governed for 16 years. The empire was stable. The treasury was full. The borders were secure. The natural disasters had passed. She had done everything that a ruler was supposed to do, and she was dying. The court physicians tried every remedy. Officials prayed at temples. But she knew what was coming. She called her ministers to her bedside and gave them final instructions. She told them to serve the emperor loyally. She told them to care for the people. She told them that her death was natural and that they should not fear it. And then she said something that the historians recorded. She said, "I have done what I could. I have tried to be worthy of the trust placed in me. Whether history judges me kindly or harshly, I cannot control. I only know that I have worked for 16 years without rest. And now I am tired." She died a few days later. She was 41 years old. The emperor she had protected took power. His name was Emperor An. And within months of her death, everything she had built began to unravel. The Deng clan was purged. Her relatives were executed or exiled. The policies she had maintained were abandoned. The court fell into factional conflict. The eunuchs gained power. The military decayed. The natural disasters returned, and this time there was no one to manage them. Within a generation, the Eastern Han Dynasty was in terminal decline. It would limp along for another century, but it would never recover the stability that Deng Sui had maintained. So why is Deng Sui not famous? Why does Wu Zetian, who ruled for half as long, appear in every history book and every documentary, while Deng Sui remains almost unknown outside of academic circles? Part of the answer is simple. Wu Zetian declared herself emperor. She broke the rules so dramatically that history could not ignore her. She forced her way into the narrative. Deng Sui did the opposite. She followed the rules. She governed as a regent, not as a sovereign. She never claimed the title that would have made her unforgettable. She made herself indispensable, and then she died, and indispensability is not the same as immortality. But there is something else. Wu Zetian fits a story that people want to hear. The woman who defied the system, who seized power by force, who became a legend. Deng Sui tells a different story. The woman who worked within the system, who wielded power competently and then disappeared. The first story is dramatic. The second is quiet. The first sells books and movies. The second gets a footnote in a textbook. But here is the question that Deng Sui's life forces us to ask. Which story is actually more remarkable? The woman who broke the rules and became famous? Or the woman who followed the rules and governed better than anyone else, and was forgotten? Deng Sui did not need to become emperor. She did not need to change the name of the dynasty. She did not need to execute her enemies or build monuments to herself. She needed only to hold the empire together during the hardest years of its history. And she did. For 16 years, she woke before dawn and went to sleep after midnight. She read every report. She made every decision. She saved millions of lives. She held the borders. She promoted the scholars and inventors who would define Chinese civilization. And then she died, and the dynasty she had saved fell apart. Perhaps that is the real story. Not the woman who became emperor. The woman who was more competent than any emperor, and was erased anyway.